All right, so I'm going to go ahead and have our 4 panel members go ahead and introduce themselves. So I thought that they could go ahead and share just who they are, what their association is with Crosspointe or this particular meeting, and then what their interest is, I guess, in this topic of mindfulness. Let me say also, go ahead and mute your videos if you don't mind. That would be awesome, so we don't have as much background noise. So I'll just go ahead and I'll ask, how about Stephen to start, and then maybe Dale, Shauna, and Tim. If you guys just want to go ahead and introduce yourselves and why mindfulness is something that matters to you.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Stephen Claybrook, and I serve at Crosspointe as the music pastor. And mindfulness is almost brand new to me. It seems like it. Just a few years ago, mindfulness was never part of any tradition, that I grew up in. But I came to the concept through a Zen master named Thich Nhat Hanh. And I listened to one of his books on tape, which is actually a compilation of audio talks from a retreat that he had done. I think it was in the 90s, but back in 2018, I heard that, and just the timing in my own life, it was perfect. It was exactly what I needed. The basics of mindfulness, of having your of practices that allow your mind and your body to be in the same place, to be in the present moment, was just I needed that at that time in my life. And so I was taken in, and then I listened to a lot, but then I started actually practicing sometime early 2019. And it's become a regular part of my daily practice, as much as I can make it happen. So that's kind of the introduction for me.
Thank you. Dale.
Hi, I'm Dale Baker. I work at Crosspointe as a worship leader for student ministries, and sometimes I will also play in the worship band as a drummer. I'm a drummer by trade. I teach private lessons and work as a drummer for hire for various organizations and groups and people. And looking back over my life, I see that mindfulness, that there were moments that I could have jumped on the mindfulness train, but because of my Christian upbringing, because of the community I was brought up in, um, uh, anything having to do with anything that was sort of woo woo was to be feared, and to be you felt like it was I'm sorry.
Like an hour?
Let's see here. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm getting distracted by the
You're good.
by the mics. So I came at all of this as a fundamentalist Christian, and then as my life progressed, uh, sort of went through a deconstruction phase and came across the work of Thich Nhat Hanh, uh, specifically his book on anger, and then eventually found my way to Richard Rohr, and then to the work of Matthew Fox, and then eventually was a student at the Living School, which was a 2-year program that the Center for Action and Contemplation has in Albuquerque. And so through my work with that and those readings, I saw that the mindfulness, it fits with the Christian tradition. There's a big history of the mystics, and it's in there if you go looking for it. And so that's what's been fun for me, is that as I let go of the fear that was sort of pushed into me as a fundamentalist, and I've opened myself to and allowed myself to be curious, I believe it. I believe God's pulled me um, deeper into my faith, deeper into um, the container that I was sort of shaped in. And so instead of being this very sort of narrow belief system, um, my faith seems to be bigger and more welcoming and more inclusive. Whereas growing up, it's very sort of exclusive, and you had to say a special prayer to get into this special club. Um, so anyway, I find that the mindfulness has allowed me to the little bit that I practice it um, has has brought it helped me to bring peace to my life. And then in my teaching practice, I've found that with my with music as a drummer, um, being mindful is something that you do as a musician. And so I've made these connections with my adult students using metronomes and talking about music as a way to practice mindfulness. And that seems like a good gateway into for the people that are suspect, that think it's um, you know if there's a lot of fear there, we can get into that through another avenue such as music. So
Awesome. And that's something that came up in the questions and the pre-registrations as well. So we'll go back to that a little bit too, of how the American Christian view intersects with it. And is it okay to practice mindfulness as a Christian, from the perspectives that some people have. So we'll get back to that for sure. But thank you for sharing that. Shauna, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Shauna Murray, and I came to Crosspointe as a neighbor working at the Northwest Carey Y. So I'm the Senior Healthy Living Director there. My journey into mindfulness started probably more in my early 30s. I was a young mom and just trying to figure out what that means. And I quit my job after I had my second, after my career being kind of the primary thing in I was the primary breadwinner for a long time. And we lived in LA and then DC and San Francisco and Chicago and Austin, Texas. And so when I decided to stay home with my second child and I decided I wasn't going to wear a suit anymore, I had missed my first kid's birthday party because of work. And I didn't want that to be my life. And so I went and got my nose pierced. And I said, if I have to work in a job where they make me take this out, I don't want to do that. And so that was, I think, my first step into mindfulness, I think, is that every time I look in the mirror, I see that decision I made. And so it was a very mindful decision. And I see that every day on my face. But during that journey, I started doing some more self-study. I started reading some books about the words we use and the impact of words we use. And so just using simple things when you're sending an email that you say, oh, I'm just trying to get this point across. Well, get rid of that word just and add power behind your statement. I'm trying to get this information across. So that I found so powerful, the words we use and how they impact how people see us. And that just kind of went from there. And then I'd always kind of practiced physical fitness, but I decided to go ahead and get my 200 hours of yoga training. And then I proceeded to get an additional 500 hours. So my kind of meditation and all of that came from a more traditional yoga background. And it's just kind of developed from there. I find that kind of everything we do in our lives, every impact we make with people. I'm looking here at the screen itself, and I see a couple people that I've had a wonderful privilege of working in programs that have not only impacted them, but have impacted me. And so the decisions that we make every day mindfully to do things impact those around us in a significant way, and that in turn it impacts you. And so how you live your daily life. And kind of circling to some of the questions that we'll ask later, I mean, that is the embodiment of Christ's love in the world. And so mindfulness, I think, reflects Christ in such a great way.
Thank you. Tim, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I would. I just want to begin by saying how much I appreciate the opportunity to be with you. And Stephen and I know each other, and our first interaction was with the Planting Seeds Sangha in Chapel Hills. It was good, Stephen, to be with you. It's also nice just to be with other wisdom people, and knowing that I will take as much from this experience and this conversation, far more than I will offer. So I always appreciate that opportunity. I guess one of the things I want to say before introducing myself is that in the Zen tradition, they use the language of beginner's mind. And beginner's mind is an assumption that there are no experts in this practice, and it is a practice. And about the time we think we're getting it right, we fail miserably and fall into old habit energies. Or at least that's been my experience. So I do not claim to be an expert in mindfulness. My first callings are as the partner to Heidi, and we have four children, caring for a 91-year-old mother in my spare time. And when we're mindful, we're always mindful of something. And for me, in full disclosure, I'm mindful of my younger brother, Ed, who is actively dying from pancreatic cancer at this hour. And so our mindfulness is really an exercise in reality, not in story. And we weave a lot of stories, and we weave a lot of narratives, and we end up relating more to story and narrative than we do to the reality of our lives as human beings. My background with mindfulness is not unlike many other people's background. I was first introduced to it when I was much younger, and I was exploring a Benedictine monastic life as a calling. I didn't choose to go in that direction, but I discovered mindfulness, although it wouldn't have been referred to as mindfulness through the works of Thomas Merton and John Main, both Benedictines. And then I was exposed to it again when I was in divinity school, and fell under the influence of a beautiful practitioner, and I so trusted his thinking and his words and his wisdom that I chose to do some of the things that enhanced his own practice. And so I've come under the influence of a lot of amazing Christians, amazing Buddhists, amazing practitioners. People are experts in soul craft, and I just feel incredible amount of gratitude to each of them. I've been the university chaplain at Wake Forest for 19 years. I started the Mindful Wake program at Wake Forest. That's the mindfulness program for the university for students, faculty, and staff. We use the Koru mindfulness curriculum that was started as a collaboration between the Counseling Center at Duke and Integrative Medicine there. And I'm a Koru instructor, and I also work for Koru on the side, helping to certify mindfulness instructors. Again, that makes it sound like I know what I'm talking about. And the reality is I don't know a whole lot more than you do. I'm ordained in the United Methodist Church. I'm an oblate in the Order of the Holy Cross, which is a Anglican monastic community on the banks of the Hudson River and across from Poughkeepsie, New York. I'm ordained in the order of the inner being, which is the Buddhist lineage of um, of Thich Nhat Hanh. And I know that sounds really strange and weird, but I like to think of it as having multiple tap roots. And for me, it provides a lot of stability. And even though I really can't explain to you why I am where I am, it has a sacred quality for me. And so I'm, again, excited to be here and look forward to learning from you.
Thank you. Thank all of you so much. We're going to start diving into some of the questions, and I wanted to start with something that is a very long question, I'm sure, to answer, but if we could answer it in a short, more simple terms, but just what is mindfulness? There may be someone on this call who, maybe has heard of the concept, but isn't totally familiar with it, as well as, and this is sort of a two-part question, but I think mindfulness and meditation can sometimes get used interchangeably or confused, and they're different. So can someone address what is mindfulness and how does that differ from meditation? And I can call on people, or you guys can just speak out either way. Stephen, thoughts?
Okay, I was just about to speak. This isn't the answer. That's why I'm hesitating. But um, for me, I think of mindfulness um, as I think of it as more of a state that you practice to be in. Yeah, mindfulness is a state that I'm in and out of. And when I'm in mindfulness, then my mind and my body, not that there's a difference, but I think of my mind, like my thoughts can be in so many places. My thoughts can be in the past, they can be in the future, but my body's always right here, wherever I am. And I think of mindfulness as a state of practicing having my mind stay here with my body. So, and then there's a bunch of techniques and practices that can help you practice that state. And I think of meditation as a, uh, a series, or there's a lot of different types of meditation, but meditation is tried and true practices that help to practice and achieve the state of mindfulness. That's how I think about it. I don't know if that's not from any textbook or anything, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah, that's good. Anyone else want to add anything to that, or does that sound? No, that's really helpful. Yeah, Dale.
I was just going to add, I think it's just another word for paying attention, like, um, or I, and that's probably an overgeneralization, but can I pay attention in this moment right now? Can I be mindful of what's, and so um, I feel like there are practices like meditation that can help you become more aware and pay attention. But that might be another word. If mindfulness sounds scary or confusing, like maybe that's another way into the idea too. So.
Mhm.
I always kind of saw mindfulness as intentionality and just purposeful. So it's just more, for me, I just see it more along the lines of, like you said, Dale, just kind of being in tune, but also like observant, to your outside world and your surroundings, but then also your inner world, whether it's your thoughts or your feelings, whether that's with your heart or just your physical, I'm cold or I'm thirsty. So I just see it more as like just being like purposeful and intentionality.
Yeah, I would add also, sorry, I've got a little bit of a hoarse throat here. Can everybody hear me?
It's soft. Yeah,
So
it's a
soft.
little soft.
I'm not sure I've got everything turned up on my end. Let me see if this is better. Is better?
Mm,
No.
yeah, yes, yes.
Better? Okay.
Good.
Yeah, let's try this. So, I mean, I can be honest. I think mindfulness is the first building block of any spiritual tradition, any Christian tradition. If you can't exercise some degree of mindfulness, I think it is impossible to have a robust um, spiritual life. It's mindfulness is what allows us to. It's kind of like the old saying that the spiritual journey is a Christian saying. Spiritual journey is 1 inch long and many miles deep. And in order to find depth in our spiritual life, we have to actually be present. And I'll just say this very quickly. Steve Taylor is someone who I follow very closely. He's a researcher at the University Leeds Beckett in the United Kingdom. And he says his research is in perceptual awareness. And he says that the average person places their attention in 3 places and 3 places only. And you're either awake for it or you're asleep. Another good way of talking about mindfulness is wakefulness, just being awake. And he says, he calls it the 3 A's. The first place we put our attention is abstraction. Second place is absorption. And the third place is awareness or conscious awareness. And he says abstraction is just compulsive thinking. And that is the human condition for most people on Sunday morning, sitting in the pew, just their brains generating thoughts. Our brains pump out about 70,000 individual thoughts per day, and 90% of them are redundant. And so that's where people get lost, just lost in thought. And we mistakenly think that we are the content of our thoughts. And of course, we know that's not true, that we are not simply the content of our thoughts. He says the second place we put our focus is what he calls absorption. That's absorption in just being busy, just busyness. You've probably noticed that when a difficult feeling or emotion comes up, we often look to our to-do list as a coping mechanism. The other part of absorption is distraction. And I don't know what your distraction is, but mine is looks a lot like a smartphone. And so we can come up with all sorts of distractions, including religion. We can use religion faster than anything to distract us from our interior landscape, our exterior landscape, and anytime God intervenes in our own personal history. If we don't like it, we'll look for the our most familiar distraction. And then the last thing he says is awareness, just being aware of what's going on inside and what's happening outside. And the last thing he says is that abstraction plus absorption equals partial awareness. It equals else-awareness. And that's what undermines every relationship, every friendship, every partnership. And he says 50 to 70% of all the people on the planet, excuse me, um, the vast majority of people on the planet spend 50 to 70% of their time not present, either lost in thought, lost in distraction, or lost in busyness. And so in our shared spiritual work, there is no divine encounter unless one is present for it. And if most people spend 50 to 70% of their life not present, then that's a challenge. That's a challenge for all of us. And so I think spirituality begins first and foremost with presence and then builds upon that. So I put a lot of value in mindfulness. And frankly, I think the future of the church is dependent upon our translation of a very, very ancient tradition that clearly clearly is embedded in the Christian contemplative practice. So that was a long explanation, but I think for me, it's an important one.
No, that's wonderful. Where do you think the like fear of it has originated from? I feel like with a lot of Christians, especially in our country, there's like resistance and fear to this practice. Does anyone have like ideas of where that originates from?
It's funny, I was actually going to go there. I think that mindfulness often gets a bad rep because it sounds selfish. It sounds like we're being selfish people, but really, I think that mindfulness is your awareness of self when it comes to your interactions with yourself and those around you. Like, it's not just about you. Mindfulness is being aware of what's around you. Mindfulness is being grateful for what is in front of you. Like, I've kind of jokingly said to my kids when they're putting the dishes away and they're irritated because they have so many dishes to put away. I'm like, I'll be grateful that we have so many dishes to put away. Then we fed you dinner tonight, like just the mindfulness of everything that we're doing. I think that people think of mindfulness or even self-care as selfish, but quite the contrary, it's opposite. But Angela, you had a second part of that first question about meditation and how is that different. I always grew up, my dad was a very prayerful man, and he would get up in the morning and go to church at like 6 o'clock in the morning and do prayer and meditation, and he put them together. And he's the kind of person who might find a little bit of fear in this conception of mindfulness because of his religious faith, but he has no problem saying prayer and meditation. Even the meditation and mindfulness often fall hand in hand. So I think it goes back to that, the words we use and how we use them, and just finding the language to explain what mindfulness is so that people become comfortable with the language they're hearing. And then circling them back around to like, well, that's what mindfulness is. But I think prayer and meditation can be a great tool to work into mindfulness. And you do have to be mindful in your prayer and meditation, unless it becomes, dogmatic and practiced in the sense that you're just going through motions.
I tell you, when I notice probably the most when I'm not mindful is with my kids. My kids, especially when they were younger, they just want to know that I'm there. They just want to know that I'm there. And I can think of even like when the kids were pre-verbal, they would just pick something up and show it to me, and it's really just, they're just checking, like, are you here? Are you here with me? And I realized how much I can be physically here, but not be mentally here. And so that's my kids have been the best teachers for me, and in showing me kind of the moment to moment pass fail. Am I here or not? And so then my practice is to be more here than not, And so one of the first ways that I found to actually practice mindfulness was to be, whenever I was in the car with one of my kids, and especially like with just one of them, it became what Thich Nhat Hanh calls a bell of mindfulness. And he says anything can be a bell of mindfulness. They use in the tradition actual bells, but he teaches that anything can become a bell of mindfulness, like a stoplight. Anytime you're at a stoplight, you can train yourself for that stoplight to be a bell of mindfulness that reminds you to come back to this moment. But I found that my kids in the car with me became a bell of mindfulness for me, because I very naturally wanted to be there for the time, the precious time that I have with that child in the car with me, to talk about whatever, or not, even if there's not conversation, am I here? Am I enjoying the silent presence that we're sharing together?
Mhm. There's a question a few minutes ago in the chat, when I think Tim was talking about smartphones, and Stephen, you too, just talking about how challenging it can be. And someone asked, do you think people were more mindful before computers or smartphones, or is it just human nature to be distracted?
Well, I think we're wired for mindfulness. It's in our DNA. All you have to do is stare at your children if you can be present enough to do that. But what happens is we're conditioned, we're socialized, and I see it all the time working with college students. We're staring down the worst mental health crisis in higher education in our lifetime, if ever. It's we got some challenges ahead of us, and so Jesus speaks specifically to this. Certainly provides some pointers. Jesus, he says, anybody puts their hand to the plow and looks over their shoulder is not worthy of the kingdom of God. Weird passage. But anybody who's ever done any plowing, which I have not, knows exactly what he's saying. If you're looking over your shoulder while you're plowing, obviously you're not going to be able to plow in a straight line. I think that's Jesus' very mindful way of saying, don't worry about what you've done up to this point. The past is gone. You did the best that you could. And there are places for healing and forgiveness, no doubt. But you and I know both that if you spend an inordinate amount of time fixated on what you did in the past and unskillful things you did in the past, if you stay there long enough, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, your anxiety level goes up. And then Jesus says in another place, well, this is a poor translation, don't worry so much about what you're going to eat, what you're going to wear, and how you're going to pay your bills. That's another way Jesus is mindfully saying, if you spend an inordinate amount of your time projecting into an unknown future, entertaining all the what ifs and all the worst case scenarios, the same thing will happen. Your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, your anxiety level goes up. And I think the reason most people in the pews on Sunday morning feel a sense of restlessness continually, as if it's a normal way to be in the world, that has devastating effects on us. Because again, if mindfulness is about presence, the only place where relationships thrive, where we're at our best as parents, when we're at our best as partners, when we're at our best in our creativity and all the things that make us unique as human beings, is being fully present in this moment, because it's the only one that we ever have. There is no future, there is no past. We only have this moment. And the greatest gift we can give another human being, and I think Jesus lived this out every day, is to give whoever is in front of you, or whatever is in front of you, your undivided attention, as if that person or that moment is the most important thing on the planet. Now, I tell my students often, I say, before the end of the day, give one other person 3 minutes of your undivided attention, as if that person is the most important person in the world, and see what happens. That's where church thrives. That's where relationships thrive. Coming back using ancient practices that predate Christianity, that actually predate, I think, Buddhism, coming back over and over and over again in this moment, stepping back out of future preoccupations and feeling shame and regret over the past, and coming right back to this moment where you can give whatever's in front of you your full attention, whether it's a person or a sunset or a sunrise or an art project. And then we don't have to worry about the future. When we get really good at that, we do not have to worry about outcomes, because then outcomes begin to take care of themselves.
But we're Western Americans and we pride ourselves on multitasking. Are you saying there's another way?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we're capable of multitasking, because there's very little depth in doing that. I think that's a survival technique that we've codified. I think we do our best work when we're fully focused in this moment. Now, we can do that quickly sometimes, but being in two places at the same time, that's actually not possible. We weren't created to be able to do that, in my opinion.
Mhm. So does that mean if we're like with someone and also texting and with them and texting, we're giving like 50% to eat? We're just not, or something? Is that what you're kind
Yeah,
of?
I think that's what Steve Taylor called elsewareness
Mhm.
or partial awareness. And we just become satisfied. We become satisfied with that,
Mhm.
as if that's a way to be in the world. If you just read the Gospels and look at how Jesus behaves through the lens of mindfulness, remember one response to an encounter, it was, if he has known me all my life. That's not magic.
Mhm.
That's actually mindfulness. That's being fully present, leaning in, listening and talking skillfully with another human being. And it is a lost art form.
Mhm. Yeah.
To piggyback on that, early on in my career, I had a boss who, when we would have our one-on-one meetings, they were always on time, and they would close their computer and they would pay attention to the words that I was saying, and they would pay attention to me. And that's something, when I meet with staff, I'll set my computer to the side and pay attention, because of the impact that it really made on me, feeling heard, feeling cared for, and just knowing that that person was actually respecting me individually. As to get there on time is one thing, right? But to put aside all the distractions and be present. And I struggle with that on a daily basis. Like, my text goes off, and I'm at dinner and we kind of have a no phone rule at dinner, but you're like, what's going on over there? You're and I've tried to turn like most of my notifications off on my phone so that I don't get distracted. But as Tim said, it's a practice. It's never perfection. We're never going to be perfect at it. But I think the way you make others feel when you give them your full attention is a practice of mindfulness.
Yeah, it's really good. Let's see, we've got so many great questions, and some of them have been sort of addressed within some of your answers here. Is there a difference between mindfulness and prayer? Kind of talked about the prayer and meditation and things like that. What would be, are they different? Are they somewhat the same? You're fully present in the presence of God, I guess. So that, are they different or the same?
I used to, I got into this habit of writing my prayers down. And I feel like that action of just writing down the thing that you're praying for, that that became a practice of mindfulness. I mean, looking back, I didn't know it at the time, but um, just the specificity of, I'm praying for this right now, and then you go to the next line, I'm praying for this, and so everything felt a little more intentional writing it down than just saying it out loud or imagining it, for me.
Yeah, I think for me, I think I love the idea of writing down prayers, Dale, because I think prayer often is our attempt to formulate language. And sometimes the formulation of the process itself can be healing and restorative. It's not like God doesn't know what we're thinking, but it can be restorative just being able um, to put our deepest desires, whether they're misformed or not, but writing them down or bringing them to the level of conscious awareness. I think the hard part is simply sitting in God's presence, transcending. Richard Ward talks about this all the time, transcending thought, and simply allowing ourselves to be in the presence of God and allowing God, not even allowing God, but inviting God to work on our hearts and bypassing our emotions and bypassing our thinking processes. And one of the most lovely meditation experiences I had was just last week, where I met with a group of Christian meditators in Kyiv, Ukraine. And they're on the other side of the world in a battle zone. And I'm with 75 other Christian meditators just meditating with these amazing people. And we hardly used any language whatsoever. We read a couple of verses of scripture. We had a time of just discursive prayer, and then we just sat. We sat for an hour and a half, and it was just incredibly powerful. And I think mindfulness creates the environment for us simply to sit with God and allow God to work on us and to be expectant that in fact will happen in ways that we can't even begin to imagine.
Mhm. So this is kind of a more practical question, but when I, how do you, how do you get into that headspace initially? How do you get, like, there's so many, like we said, distractions. How do you, I know you can go outside or get into an environment that's like separate in a way, but how do you fully like slow your mind down and remove some of those internal distractions in order to like focus on that? And the thought of even, I remember when I first became a Christian, it was like you were supposed to do a quiet time for 1 hour. And that's just feels so long. It was so hard to focus and all this stuff. But like, I mean, this conversation sounds so amazing. I'd love to do it for 6 hours in a day, but how do you do that? And you know what I mean? How do you slow down enough and really like do that?
The introduction point, and it remains the basic practice for me. The introduction point that I was invited into mindfulness through Thich Nhat Hanh was mindfulness of my breath. It was just the basic. The very first thing I heard him say was, breathing in, I know I'm breathing in. And then breathing out, I know I'm breathing out. And it just like a light bulb went off. Like, I breathe however many times a day. I don't know what the math is on that. And most of those breaths I'm not aware of. And so the practice of being aware of the breath, and it can happen in, 10 seconds. And that's a mindfulness, that's a moment of practicing mindfulness. So then when you get into meditation, then you're kind of committing, you're setting aside a time to be aware of your breath for a longer period of time. But the practice can be, in right now, it can be while I'm listening. If I notice my mind is wandering, I can come back uh, by internally just being aware of my in breath and my out breath. And just one or two times of that can bring me back to this moment.
I, I find that, I think the way in is just what are you feeling now? And and so I've had moments where I'm driving, it's rush hour, and I'm getting angry at the other drivers, or I'm feeling slighted by, like we all do sometimes. And so in those moments, it's like, oh, wait a second, I'm getting angry. Why are you getting angry? Because of that. And so instead of this being a really peaceful thing of intentionality, it's really messy at first, but I'm just naming what I'm doing right now in the moment. I'm really angry at that guy, and that's ridiculous. And I feel like getting to that place where you can name what you're feeling or where you're at right now is probably, it's it it's not as peaceful and it's not as beautiful of a picture, but it's like it's a start. And that might be the way in of like just where I'm at right now. I am just not happy. Okay, great. Let's just acknowledge that, And so I feel um like using a feelings wheel, those things of like there's this, there's all these different definitions of how I'm feeling. And so you can go around the wheel and be like, where am I at on that wheel? Great. Let's just focus on that. So uh, that's that's how I would say, you can start. You don't have to get in a special spot or anywhere. You can just start, right away. So
Um, for me, a real practical way that I kind of started was when we moved to Chicago. I'm a California girl, and Chicago winters were hard, and I had a couple young babies, and just trying to find happiness in everything that I did was a struggle for a while. And I was listening to music, and I heard Nina Simone's "Feeling Good," and I decided that that was going to be my mantra song that year. And so every computer login I did, everything I did was feeling good. So like it constantly reminded me that that was my end game, right? And so when we're thinking about like practical ways we can remind ourselves of something, things that we have to do every day in our life, just reminding ourselves that that's what we want to do. That's our mantra for that week or month or whatever it might be, that you're going to feel good that week. And like it did mess with me, and it made me feel better. And I think my husband was tired of hearing that song by the end of that time, but I still love that song. But since I put my husband in a spotlight, like little things like eating, how many of us just mindlessly eat? And I'm only 5'2", and like as a woman of a certain age, I don't want to gain a lot of weight, and I want to keep a strong heart. So even when it comes to eating, like I'll take a measuring cup, and put peanuts in it, and I will like pop one peanut in my mouth, and like I'll swirl the salt and I'll taste it. And I really have come to enjoy that. Or M&Ms are a great example of that too. Like you can just, it's a really nice, you smell it, you feel it, you taste it, you're creating all these sensations in that moment of eating. And I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, we were talking about how Jesus loved to eat. And I feel like all the stories about him eating are really mindful stories, are very like intentional stories. And so even if it is one meal a day where you're like, this is the meal where I'm going to be intentional about, and I'm going to take my bites, and I'm really going to enjoy what I'm eating. There's just another way of practically being a mindfulness in a practical way.
Yeah, this is really rich. One things I would want to add is that most people are familiar with, 5 or 6 or 10 or 12 mindfulness practices or anchor points. But it's important to note that there are hundreds of thousands of practices and anchor points, as many perhaps as there are people, which I think is really, is really beautiful. And the breath is the easiest one, unless you've had breathing issues. or unless someone sexually assaulted you. Perhaps the breath is not the anchor point for you. And so I think in any mindfulness work, we have to be trauma sensitive. I just assume every time that I teach a mindfulness class, 1 out of 4, 1 out of 8 faculty, students, of staff have suffered some sort of significant trauma that they have not been able to integrate. And so I try to provide a lot of different mindfulness practices. An example of that would be a body scan, which is a familiar practice for many yoga practitioners and mindfulness practitioners. But I run into students all the time who do not feel comfortable in laying on the floor in the dark with the strangers around them. So I think that's really important. One of the things we do at Wake Forest is we're starting to use the arts. We have a Mindful Wake Artist series where we bring people into art museums and we use the collection or the exhibition as the anchor point. And so people get prompts. They go look at the different pieces of art. One prompt may be pick up a painting or a sculpture or a piece of art that speaks to where you are right now in your own journey. And then they have a chance to share that. And then at the end of our time, we go back into the studio and we create art ourselves. So art can really do that. Um, I teach contemplative or mindful photography and in a school for the visual arts because I found photography a lovely anchor point. And so we talk about when you take a good photograph as an example, you pause, you focus, and you connect. And what makes for a good photograph makes for a rich spiritual life, makes for a great marriage or a partnership or a friendship. So we use photography, the mechanics of photography, as a way to help people integrate trauma into their lives. And so I think you can be super creative in applying mindfulness because when you're mindful of what? Everything. And if you're not, if it's hard, you're mindful of it being hard. If it's almost impossible to be still, then be mindful of that. The Dalai Lama said that he can only go about 3 minutes before his mind wanders off. So I think, we get caught up in comparing and contrasting mind. How am I doing in comparison to Stephen? Or judging mind will trip us up. But in mindfulness, we're just mindful of whatever comes up for us. I think at any given moment without passing judgment on it. And that's just hard. That's countercultural for pretty much everybody on the planet. At least it is for me.
Yeah, and I think for those of us that grew up in like more fundamentalist traditions, when we're left alone with our thoughts, the voice that we hear in our head is a um, punitive voice that is not affirming and is not welcoming. And so I feel like that's part of the fear of mindfulness is like when you get alone with yourself, there's a lot of stuff in there that you might not know what to deal with, and that can be scary. And then if that's somehow tied in with uh, a mis, with a misguided religious upbringing, then it can be a dangerous, it might be a dangerous move. So I feel like you dip your toes in the water as best as you can, and if it's too much, then get the hell away and you try it some other day. There's no pressure, um, but but I feel like that's part of the I think the fear of some faith organizations or whatever is that if as long as we keep it above our neck, we're fine. But as soon as we get down into our body, feelings and sensations and all of that, it gets it's too messy. The incarnation is not welcome.
Hey,
But I
Dale,
feel
I think I don't think that's limited to people who grew up in evangelical traditions. Good
oh,
Lord. Catholics know that better than probably anybody. But I do believe in my heart that most of the violence that takes place on our planet every single day is self-inflicted, 10 times over. I mean, think about the internal voices
yeah.
um, that that people listen to and give credence to. And we would never ever speak to our friend the way that we talk to ourselves. And that's an ongoing conversation that takes place every single day for most people. I think you really hit on something there.
Yeah, and I feel like mindfulness, the whole idea that, you love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. Like, yeah, we can focus externally all the time, but that loving ourselves is so difficult. Yet I feel like that's got to come like true that you know it's everything's going to work out better if we deal with ourselves first, and that self work. I think mindfulness is a great way to kind of you know to explore that stuff, and to have it lead you towards getting the help that you need, or getting uh, you know uh, others to speak into your life with new language and more affirming um, uh, words. Yeah.
I would also add, I think older adults, if I were serving in the local church right now as a pastor, I would have a mindfulness program for young adults. I mean, for older adults. And the reason for that is that the mental health of our older population is not great. Many of them have mental health issues that have gone undiagnosed. And I can't imagine going into the last quarter of my life without a mindfulness practice. So that when grief comes up, my 90-year-old mother has outlived everybody. 9 siblings. She's outlived her parents. She's outlived her best friends. And so if mindfulness is this process of bringing to the surface everything that we keep submerged, like taking a beach ball and keeping it under the water continually, how exhausting that is. It just wants to see the light. And in Tibetan Buddhism, they call it cupping. When we bring something up that we've kept hidden, we bring it to the light that takes energy out of it, which is incredibly healing just by itself. We see it for what it is. We expose it to God's love and God's grace so that we can care for it and ask other people to help us care for it, ask God to help us care for it. And it's called cupping because it's like a parent holding a crying child. It's all right. It's going to be all right. And yet, so many people go through their entire lives without this choreography. That's what healing is about. Is it bringing it into the light so that we can find healing? And sometimes healing is just, me calling Dale and saying, let's go for a walk. That could be it. And older adults and young adults and need these tools. I'm convinced that one of these days, in fact, at Wake Forest, over the past 5 years, we're beginning to see high school students who have a mindfulness background. Now, those are primarily private school students, but I'm convinced, not unlike what happened with yoga, that eventually mindfulness will be something that more and more people are going to be exposed to. But I think the church needs to take a lead there because it's embedded within our tradition.
And I just recently heard there's a Brene Brown podcast recently where she's talking to a research scientist, and they're just talking about research and data, and it's not it didn't feel like a faith-based or spiritual conversation. I mean, that was in there, but they were just talking about data points and science about, how your brain responds to mindfulness and meditation. And so I feel like, yeah, I agree with you, Tim, like that it's going to become a lot more normalized, I guess,
Yeah, I appreciate this perspective a lot because I think that what you guys were talking about a few minutes ago is one of the fears, I think, of it's kind of like the fear of like going into therapy or really like doing self-reflection or personal work is like what's going to come up. And like what you shared, Dale, about being in the car and being angry and letting that anger rise up. And then what you shared, Tim, about how to handle that. You just sort of notice it and you take care of it, but you don't judge it or condemn it or allow that like self-critic to like, push it back down. You let it sit there and be there and just kind of just like you would with your child or your friend. I think it's so common that we like are so mean to ourselves or critical at times and allow those condemning voices to sort of take over. So I think that's a really beautiful perspective to have, that we kind of care for ourselves in that. We just sort of notice it and then care for ourselves in the midst of those, whatever comes up.
Well, I think one thing in Buddhism that we really should embrace in Christianity, and we've always had a hard time with the focus on ancestors. And one of the things that Buddhism teaches is that some of the crap that we carry around with us is not ours. It was our parents, and it was their parents and their parents, and it goes back multiple generations. And it gets, unless there's healing and reconciliation and restorative health, then it gets passed down from generation to generation to generation, not because people are necessarily mean or insensitive, is because we're not skilled.
Mhm.
We're not skilled at this, bringing it up so that we can find healing. So in some respects, when I become increasingly more mindful and do my deep spiritual work, I'm not just healing myself, I'm healing generations going in both directions.
Mm.
And sometimes I'm cutting a trend or a way of being and preventing it from moving forward. If we're ever going to do anything with systemic racism in our country, then it will have to have some kind of mindfulness associated with it. If you've not read Ruth King, who lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, she has a wonderful book entitled Mindful of Race that is really worth getting a study group around. But it's going to require to see privilege and systemic racism through a mindfulness lens.
Mm. Sounds really interesting. There's a couple of questions in the chat that I want to make sure I say so that you guys can answer those. The first one, going back a little bit, was, is it mindfulness to understand and live by, quote, all we have is now? Is that mindfulness?
I think so. Yeah.
I'll say yes and Stephen.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's part of why people are afraid of being mindful, because they think it's selfish, right? Or that like all we have is now. That's kind of a bad way of living your life. But I think living mindfully means seeing God in everything and everywhere and interacting in our environment in that way. To love and care for those, to love and care for ourselves, to love and care for those around us.
Yeah. Go ahead.
One thing another thing that I got from Thich Nhat Hanh is that when you're established in the present, then you can bring the past into the present. and deal with things in the past. But the only place that you can do that is in the present. So you have to be present for that. And then the future is going to be made of the present. So the best thing you can do for the future is to, this is like exactly his words, is to take good care of the present moment. But you have to be rooted in, to not get lost in the future in thinking about, scenarios that may or may not happen, and not being mindful of being lost in the future. That's what you want to try to avoid. So the way you can do that is to establish yourself in the present moment, and then kind of bring whatever the meeting that's coming up or whatever into this moment. What can I do in this moment about that? I think that may be subtle, but there's a difference between getting lost in the future on one hand versus being established in the present moment and doing what you can about the future in this moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's spot on. I mean, the thing about the present moment is that, that actually is all we have. It's just it. We can think about the future. We can think about the past. But every time you step out of the future and preoccupy yourself with future thinking, or preoccupy yourself with the past, you step away from what's in front of you. And our faith is embodied. It requires a presence. And so it doesn't mean you don't learn from your mistakes. It doesn't mean you don't plan for the future. What it means is that the vast majority of people spend most of their time either in future thinking or regurgitating the past. And so I think prayer, mindfulness invites us to keep coming back over and over and over and over again into this moment where life happens, and where we can respond to the miracle that is life. And I just think that's what God calls us to every waking moment.
And I would add to that too, like a practical way to try to feel what the present moment is I've found that pulling up a metronome, if you just search Google metronome, it'll pop up, and then you just want to slide that metronome all the way to the left, and if you can go down lower than 40 beats per minute, great, but that thing will click 40 beats per minute. And so the game is, can you just stay with that click as long as possible, and in practicing that, it's you're developing that ability to be like, I'm right here right now, and then now I'm right there, and then from doing something as sort of not related to the rest of your life, I feel like that practicing something like that might be a way that you inadvertently find yourself paying more attention, in other areas of your life.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, you're not trying to stop thought. That's not what mindfulness is about, and you couldn't do it if you wanted to. Remember, you got 70,000 thoughts every single day, and each thought pulls up an emotion with it. The key is to get really good at practicing being a good observer. Thoughts and emotions. The average thought lasts 90 seconds unless you grab hold and hang on for dear life. And so you're just really exercising that observing mind. And then if you do that long enough, inevitably you ask the question, well, then who is the observer? Well, Jesus answers that question for us. Jesus says very clearly that there's a divine spark in each of us just beneath the surface. And the vast majority of people are so lost in compulsive thinking mind or in distraction, they don't even know that. I can't tell you how many times I have leaned over and leaned in front of a student and said, you do realize that you're not the content of all your thoughts, that there's something deep inside that's ancient and wise and primordial and God-given. And inevitably tears start to form in people's eyes as if they're hearing it for the very first time. And I think mindfulness leads us to that question in the Christian church. Who is the observer? Who is deep inside of me looking at all that mental activity, all those thoughts, the emotions, all the things that happen in my physical form? Who observes that? And I think that's what people come to church for, because all that has been socialized and conditioned out of us. To realize that that's when you start living from that, a place of depth like that, everything changes. Because then you're not dependent upon being successful at work. Great if you are. Doesn't make any difference. You have degrees and credentials and license. Great if you do. But you're not defined by any of that. And that's ultimately where mindfulness in the Christian tradition leads. There is more to you than what you think about yourself or about the world. And that changes everything. Because then it doesn't make any difference what happens. Hope you have a great life. But it doesn't make any difference. Because now you know your authentic self. And does anybody remember the little Weebles? In the 1980s, there's these little children's toys called Weebles. They wobble, but they don't fall down. You just knock them over and they go back and forth until they find their center. I carry a Weeble. It took me forever to find one. I carry one with me everywhere I go when I talk about mindfulness. That's the best visual image of what it does for us. You can't prevent this from happening. Life just happens. It comes at us sideways every single day, and we're getting knocked over and over again. But we stay resilient because mindfulness reminds us of who we are at our core. So it doesn't make any difference what life does to us. We eventually find our center. And we use ancient practices that allow us to do that. And we live in a world that needs this more than ever before, especially coming out of 2 years of COVID. We need another year, not unlike in the Jewish tradition. We need another year just to grieve as communities, as congregations. And that's where mindfulness can be really helpful.
That's all so good. I wish we had all night to talk about this. I want to get to the other question in the chat and then probably have to wrap up pretty soon here. Someone asked, they said that they like Eckhart Tolle. Is that how you say his name? Tolle? Heard it pronounced both ways. They like him a lot. And he says that we create our own suffering. If you are more mindful, would you have less suffering, in your opinion? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm going to say yes. Yeah, like we've kind of talked a little bit about this. We're all our worst critics, right? And the stories we tell ourselves. I mean, I have kids, and the stories that they tell themselves about an interaction that we have are sometimes baffling to me. Because I'm like, I was in the same room and I lived that same experience, but I didn't live your experience. So the story you're telling yourself, the story I'm telling myself, they're all very different stories. And so we create all this grief that's unnecessary. But if maybe we were more in the moment and less in our heads, we might have a better shared story.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we can't avoid pain. Just can't. Comes with being human. Suffering's optional every single time because it's self-inflicted. That's the reason people can look at the exact same thing or have the exact same experience, and one person suffers and the other person doesn't.
Mhm.
I am very far away from being at that place. But I think suffering is optional.
I find myself curious about more about the question. And so, Emily, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you're willing to talk more about where that question's coming from, I just found myself curious about what's behind it in order to give much thought to it. I mean,
Yeah, so
I'm still prepared to answer it.
it was from when he was talking about older adults. You know, going through a lot of grief, I was thinking like, if you had a mindfulness practice, you know, kind of for all those years, would it like affect, would it, like, it's hard to say what I'm saying, but I really like reading about it, but it just seems very hard to like just observe and not, you know, have a lot of emotion and things like that. So I guess that's where I was coming from, is like, would you have less grief? Would you have less when you're going through like those hard things?
Thank you for that, Emily. For me, I've noticed that practicing mindfulness doesn't lessen the experiences that I have. It doesn't mean I have fewer experiences of pain or fewer experiences of grief or fewer emotional. It's put me more, it's put me more in touch with my emotions. I have more emotional, I have more surprising emotional responses that spring up the more mindful I am. But it shows me how much for myself I've been disconnected from those experiences by kind of numbing myself and not feeling or not experiencing something because I'm afraid to, or it's going to be on the painful side and I only want the things that aren't painful. That's just as an example. So for me, I would say the practice won't necessarily lessen the number of experiences or whatever, but it gives you tools to take care of it better, to handle it better, and to integrate those experiences into your life and not have them be dormant and kind of drive you in ways that you're not aware of. Maybe that's the best I can do.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's very helpful.
Well, and grief and emotion, to actually feel them, experience them, and be in them is part of mindfulness. Letting yourself move through all of that and being aware of how you're reacting to that. That is part of mindfulness, and that's part of human nature.
Yeah, I would also add, I appreciate the question about suffering. I think people, if they're human, are going to experience physical pain, emotional pain. When I talk about suffering, I'm talking about that point in our life where we no longer know this, when we're no longer aware of that divine spark that exists within. And so throughout our lives, we make all sorts of choices. Throughout our lives, we are conditioned in a variety of different ways that sometimes make it really, really hard to live into this deeper place. But there are choices that we make, and there's choices of other people that we inherit. And so some of it we can't avoid, but the suffering is a conscious choice that we make, and we're either aware of it or we're not aware that we're making it at the time. And that's not a value judgment. It's not meant to be a judgment on us. It just means that our conditioning sometimes makes it really, really hard to avoid the suffering that so many people experience and feel on a daily basis, and feel less than, and feel impoverished in some way.
So great. I want to, I'm gonna mute. I want to just let you guys know that Tirza had put a statement in there. A couple of you guys were asking about possibly a group or more conversation around this topic. So if that's something you're interested in, go ahead and email Tirza, and maybe we can try to arrange for something like that to happen at Crosspointe. So let's see, new messages. There's Tirza's email address. But I want to wrap up because I just don't want to go past 9. And I feel like every time we get into a great new question, we get into a lot of depth with it. So I'm just going to go ahead and close us off now. But I wanted to say thank you so much to everybody on our panel. That was incredibly helpful. And I have a list of questions we didn't even get to. So we'll have to think about part 2 at some point in the future, but really, really appreciate all of you guys coming and you guys speaking just so thoroughly and from your hearts about this topic. I think it's really good. And I do think we have some practical ways to kind of get started now. I guess I will say, just to close it, one last thing, which would just be, if you guys have any just sort of off the top of your head or really quick kind of, if you're interested in doing something this week or reading something this week or something to that effect, maybe what someone could turn to. So I'll kind of throw that out to the panel members before we hang up. But then also, if you want to email me more, I can get this out to the group. I can get out a list of resources, and Dale already emailed me a few. But does anybody have any quick thoughts on that? Like where people can just leave here tonight and take a next step into developing this practice more?
I have a quick thought about that, and it's not reading about it. It's a simple practice that you can do. You could go for a walk and choose to coordinate your breath with your steps. So maybe you need to breathe in for, depending on how fast you're walking, for 2 steps or maybe 3 steps, and then breathe out for the same number of steps, and just try to stay in that try to keep that in your awareness. So obviously you're looking and making sure the steps that you're taking are safe, and you're watching what's happening around you. But rather than seeing something and then following a thought that comes from that, try to come. That will happen, but the practice is then kind of coming back to breath and steps. And I've found that combination of breath and steps really has been effective for me. And I find benefits in other, when I'm in a meeting or something, that I'm able to remain more present and aware for having practiced that simple thing of just taking a walk and coming back to my breath and my steps.
Love that. Anybody else have like a quick practical tip or anything like that?
I recently led a work meditation. Sometimes you feel so overwhelmed you can't figure out what you're going to do next. And so it was just 2 minutes of a brain dump, where you literally set a timer and you write everything down that is in your mind for 2 minutes. And then you set those to the side, and then you give yourself 2 minutes of just breath, eyes closed, just breathe. And that works in two ways. Like it helps to clear your mind so that you can actually focus on your breath. But then if you're someone who wants to feel like you're being a little bit productive in your process, it gives you a list to take away afterwards and complete those tasks. So
That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
I have to think that that's more. I have to think that that 4 minutes ends up being better on both ends, more productive and more presence than maybe a typical 4 minutes might be if you're just kind of lost in thought.
Right. It's just a nice way to get everything out of your brain so that you can focus for a while.
Love that.
My favorite mindfulness practice is a simple one. It's one they use in Buddhist monasteries to teach children about gratitude. And there's some science behind it too. And I do this every night. I've done this every night for 8 years. Before you go to bed at night, you take your hands like this. It's called the 10-finger gratitude exercise. Place them on your chest or hold them up the air. And just 10 things you're grateful for today. Now, it's hard to do it this way at first, and you have to commit to 2 weeks. I always tell the students, you got to do it every night for 2 weeks. Second night, it's a little bit easier. Third, fourth night, it gets really easy, and you start finding little things, little crazy things, like I found York peppermint patty in the back of my freezer. Mm-hmm. I ate it. I think it had been there a decade, and it was fantastic. So just little things, little conversations, emails you've gotten from people or a friend, or a moment of clarity, a moment when you were gentle with yourself, okay? So the science behind this is that your brain loves homework. And after about 4 or 5 days, your brain catches on, and your brain actually will start surveying your environment for 10 things to be grateful for, because you know it's coming at the end of the night. What you're actually doing is you're creating a neural pathway, a gratitude neural pathway. And the great thing about it is that your brain will get really good at this. And it is impossible to be anxious and grateful at the same time. Brain can't do it. And so if you take these 10 things and write them in a book, which I've been doing, whenever your negativity bias kicks in, we all have a pretty well developed negativity bias. We can have a perfectly good day and one thing goes wrong, and then there's this great train wreck. Yeah, you can pick up your little gratitude book and open it to any page, and there are 100 different things you're grateful for over the course of, week or so. It's a great practice. I recommend it highly, and it's addictive. And there's a book that's been written by someone I found in Nashville called 44,000 Things That I'm Grateful For. And so I recommend that practice. It's an easy one.
I love that. It's awesome. Well, thank you all again. And we're going to wrap up 9:02, 2 minutes late. I apologize, but thank you all so much for coming. And yeah, hopefully you'll be there for the next community conversation, topic to be determined. Maybe part 2 of this. I don't know. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you, everybody.